Hey, my name is Mark Walsh from Embodied Yoga Principles. This video is an introduction to trauma education for yoga teachers. Trauma education, I think, absolutely essential for anyone working with body, anyone working particularly in yoga, absolutely essential. So, just to state my qualifications, I do have a degree in psychology. I'm not a therapist. I refer to therapists, which is something I'll get onto. I've worked in the field of trauma education for a few years. Everything from sort of the light end, like, I don't know, stress management workshops in the company, right up to working in war zones. I've done trauma education for major charities like Save the Children, Oxfam, War Child, both in areas of conflict, like working with the military in Sierra Leone, working in Afghanistan, Israel, Palestine, Ukraine with soldiers fairly recently, and also like head offices, these kind of places in London, Oxford, and places like that. So that's a little bit about me. I'm not a yoga teacher. I have been practicing yoga for 20 years. I do train yoga teachers in psychological aspects of the work, something called Embodied Yoga Principles. What else? Yeah, that's my background. Why is this important? Well, we want to learn a little bit about trauma. I would argue, as anyone who's teaching any body, mind, art, including yoga, so that we don't do any damage, right? Like, basic principle, do no harm. So we want to help people. We want to help people at work. I think that's fair to say of any yoga teacher watching this, I hope. So in order, the basic principle, if we can help people, is not to harm them. The problem is, if you don't know about this stuff, you may well be harming people accidentally. Even with the best intentions. A lot of this trauma education really does come from the West as well, Western psychological traditions. There are sometimes Asian parallels, but if I'm going to be a bit blunt, this education is massively missing from traditional yoga teaching, and some traditional yoga teaching is actively harmful from a trauma point of view. A lot of the sort of guru student type model in the Western context is just harmful. It might be controversial, but please hear me out. I think once you hear some of these things, it will make sense. So this video is an introduction. It's going to be longer than some of my normal videos. It's based on a little talk that I did to an Embodied Yoga Principles teacher training group recently. They really liked it. They said, you know what, can you make a video for us, so for you guys, but also for the wider world, because this is stuff that just we all agree needed to be out there. It's not always common knowledge, and that's problematic for the reasons I said. So this isn't, this doesn't make you a trauma therapist, this video. It will give you some background knowledge, some educational kind of knowledge. If you can get to a proper trauma sensitive yoga training, then do that. Who to name plug? So Matthew Remski's got one online, awesome guy, one of the smartest guys in yoga, really clued up about this kind of stuff. Sarah Holmes de Castro is in Canada and also does courses in Brighton, UK, where I live. I recommend her. I trust her. I know her stuff. There's some really good stuff coming out of Boston. There's some trauma sensitive stuff coming out of there. I don't know those guys personally, but what I've seen looks really high quality. So there's other stuff popping up. I think yoga's really waking up to this, which is brilliant, which is really good. So I hope this video helps for the people that kind of can't get to a training. Even if you're not going to do trauma sensitive classes, like, I would really love this information to just be part of every teacher training. So if you run a teacher training, consider getting me, someone else. Like, there's lots of people out there that do trauma sensitive stuff. I can recommend people in most countries. Consider getting someone in for doing a day on a 200-hour teacher training. I think would be a sort of minimum responsible criteria. Okay. So, what is trauma? Well, there's something called the Diagnostic Statistical Manual. It has a particular definition of trauma. Psychological, it's not verbatim, but the impact of an event which can be threatening to life or the integrity of self, for example, the rape. Yeah. So trauma is very interesting. It has this definition which is based on the actual external event, which is quite unusual. I think it is important to recognise both objective and subjective elements of trauma. So yes, you could be traumatized by, I don't know, let's say you're a rich girl who doesn't get a pony. Yeah, that's not the same as being, I don't know, assaulted by 10 guys or gang raped or something. Yeah, so we do need to recognise differences, but there is this subjective element. For example, there's one study that says that football supporters, if they are incredibly attached to their team, that's part of their self, when those teams get relegated a division, when they get put down a division, there's actually a trauma response. Yeah, so it's interesting. It has this subjective element, but I think it's important we move beyond saying, hey, I was traumatized, I couldn't get any chocolate, or that word traumatized me. It's like, did it traumatize you, or did it merely disagree with it? Did it upset you a little bit? That's different. So this is an acute trauma response, the symptoms of which I'll get onto, And in many cases, that will then fade. Yeah, so we have something called natural resilience, natural hardiness. People bounce back. Even in, say, the case of a rape, one of the worst things that can happen to a person, most of us would agree, I think, 50% of people don't develop long-term trauma symptoms from that, which is incredible, actually. That's incredible when you think about it. We have this natural hardiness. So it's important to remember if anything traumatic happens to you or a student, then part of the frame is you may well bounce back, particularly if you do certain things, which I'll come up to. Obviously, no bad if you don't, that's unpredictable in many ways, but this idea that we can have an acute trauma response and then heal from that. I'll give you an example. I was in a car accident, almost died, pretty hardcore car accident, and for a few days I was, it's like I had loads of coffee, I was buzzing, I couldn't sleep, my heart was racing, had what's called a hyperarousal response. And then just after a few days, I talked to people, I went about my life, I just did normal stuff, I didn't get therapy or anything, and it went away after 3 days, yeah? Sometimes it takes a bit longer than that. If there are still traumatic symptoms after a period of time, then we can say it's a chronic trauma response, and it might be one of a set of conditions, the most famous of which is PTSD, post-traumatic stress response. There are others, however, such as generalized anxiety disorder, GAD. That's actually more common than PTSD. For example, British soldiers have 3 times as much GAD than PTSD. So there are these other conditions, and there's related things. For example, addiction problems may well be an attempt to self-medicate. As a result, anger management issues, for example, may well be related to this hyperarousal. So if trauma is this bodily, physical, psychological, social, emotional, spiritual even response to something which is overwhelming, so that's the key word here, it's something overwhelming. So it's not just simply something stressful, yeah, but something overwhelming to the self, threat to life, threat to the integrity of the self. So acute response, potentially but not always, a chronic response of some kind, which could look like a condition such as PTSD. Right, symptoms, signs and symptoms. So starting to discuss this already, 3 major groups for PTSD that we'll also see in other conditions. One is hyperarousal responses. So one way of thinking about trauma, it's not entirely accurate, it's almost accurate, is it's like the fight or flight response, that natural response we have to some kind of stress gets at a high level, is then caught in the system more permanently. Yeah, so good way of thinking about this if you're relatively new to this field. Basic fight or flight response, we all mammals have, when there's a shock, our heart rate goes up, our adrenaline goes up, our cortisol level goes up, certain parts of our brain light up, certain parts of our brain, the lizard brain takes over, the neocortex more gets dampened down, there's various other pathways, various other things that are happening chemically, biologically, neurologically, etc. So when that response happens in the short term, this may have been adaptive for our ancestors, not so adaptive in the modern world, which is why we learn things like centering and grounding. And certainly not adaptive if that gets caught in the system long term. So a soldier in Afghanistan, for example, let's say they got shot at in Afghanistan, and they had that hyperarousal response. So that could be hypervigilance, like constantly watching out, maybe sleeping less. It might look like anger symptoms, anxiety symptoms. But some of those symptoms may have actually been useful at the time, like the hypervigilance, right? Like I was working in the slums of Brazil, very violent place. And at one point my mother came over to visit me for Christmas, and I said, Mum, we can't stay here. So she took me to this nice hotel when I was a very young man, and we stayed in this nice hotel, and for the first couple of days I was like looking around, and she said, Mark, what the hell's going on, what are you looking for? And I just got really used to like tracking for danger, like a hypervigilance symptom. And then in that safe place, loving environment, loving people, gradually that went down again. So again, this time mediated by relationship, mediated by health and well-being, that hypervigilance went down. Yeah. Also sleeplessness. In that time in Brazil, I was sleeping maximum 4 hours a night, and even then I kind of had one eye open. Yeah, when I was sleeping. So this idea of hypervigilance, hyperarousal, sleeplessness, it's like that fight or flight response is just turned on the whole time. Which, if you're like a guy in a supermarket, it's difficult. Now, if you imagine in a yoga class, the teacher's saying, everybody relax, do Shavasana or nice slow asana sequence, maybe not so easy for someone like that, for someone with those kind of levels of arousal, it might be very difficult for them to stay still in a way which might seem strange, why can't they concentrate on a meditation, for example? Well, with hyperarousal, very difficult to concentrate. I remember I did meditation with military in Sierra Leone, doing some peace building stuff there, and even a 1 minute meditation those guys found hard, and they were nice guys, they were smart guys, they really wanted to learn, they were motivated, but they found even a 1 minute mindfulness of breath meditation to be quite hard. You know, the body generally can be a threatening place. So asking people to go to the body when there's stored trauma, it could be, you know, numbing symptoms. You've got the hyperarousal, we've got the numbing symptoms. That can chronic bands of tension. So when people are traumatized, there's fear or anger, whatever, that's overwhelming. So what happens is the body tenses up, which A is part of that fight or flight freeze response particularly, but B is also a way of numbing. Yeah. So take this bottle of water, I can feel that it's heavy. If I tense my arm, it's very difficult to feel the weight of that bottle of water. Simple example, but actually emotionally as well. Yeah, if we're tightening the muscles, we're not feeling. So the movement, the feeling side of the nervous system are interlinked completely. So it's a way of numbing, which again is adaptive. So if you're asking people to feel the body, first of all, they might not be able to. So the level of body awareness might not be so great, which can be dangerous for asana. Yeah. Also, it might not be a safe place to go. People might not want to go to the body. Let's say you keep doing body scan meditation. Well, maybe like a sound meditation might be better for people. Yeah. There might be resistance to that. There might be difficulty with that because these numbing symptoms. Those numbing symptoms can also lead to problems with empathy, problems with social skills. You know, we say trauma is toxic to relationship. Yeah. Toxic to relationship. Also difficult with boundaries is another one we'll find in kind of trauma relational. How is this relevant as a yoga teacher? Well, you're telling people what to do as a yoga teacher, normally in some authoritarian kind of frame, even if it's implicit, even if you're the nicest person in the world, when someone enters a yoga class, they expect to be told what to do. That's the format that they expect. That's the Asian tradition that's generally presented to us. Teacher knows best. Well, if someone's got difficulty with boundaries, they may either kick back against that, like, I'll do what I want, you know. So you're like, well, what's going on there? So it helps to understand that. Or, I think more commonly in yoga, have a good no. So you might say, hey, can I adjust you in this? Can I push you a little bit further into this? And they might say, asking permission, please do that. Yeah. So even if you do that, they might say, yeah, because they've learned to comply. Say someone is abused as a child, someone's raped by a partner, beaten by a partner. They learn that resistance is dangerous. They learn that saying no is dangerous. It's better to go along with things and survive, even if it's unpleasant. Yeah. So how do you know, as a yoga teacher, being aware of these issues around consent, being super keen on opt-in consent for touch. Okay. Otherwise, you're just deepening people's trauma, worsening making people's issues with boundaries worse. I've seen these consent cards now. They're really cool. I like those. You know, adjust or don't adjust. Easy opt-in, doesn't have to be verbal, can be non-verbal. You know, for me, my students, verbal is the gold standard still. Opt-in consent, not like at the beginning class, hey, anyone doesn't want adjustments, put their hand up. Oh, no, I have to expose myself. Yeah, so opt-in consent, this is really helping with some of the boundary issues. Realizing a yes might not be a real yes. You can kind of hear it in the voice often if there's a sort of fight-flight response, like, yes, okay, that's a maybe is a no. General rule of thumb. So you can help people with the boundary stuff by really respecting that, and you know, being aware that touch might not be a friendly thing for people. Like for me or you, touch might be like, yeah, hugs are nice. I like touch. I have a pretty good experience in my life with touch. You know, for someone that's been physically abused, sexually abused, maybe not so much. Yeah. If we look at some of the positions people are in a yoga class, let's take downwards dog, where your ass is right in the air. That's a super submissive, super vulnerable position. If you're teaching downward dog, you could potentially be teaching people to be more submissive. You know, I had a teacher adjust me from downwards dog, and even someone who hasn't been sexually abused, I was like, get off me, girl. I was freaking out. Like, what are you doing? Sliding up behind my ass from behind. That's not cool. So there's some of those vulnerable positions, you know, people in Shavasana with their legs open, for example, you know, walking between their legs, obviously dumb, you know. So some of these things, though, if you haven't had any abuse, if you haven't been around abuse, people might not be obvious, actually, so not dumb, my bad. Yeah, actually just being aware that some people may have radically different experiences of boundaries, the body, different positions they may be in that might be more or less vulnerable, like lying down positions or head down positions where they can't see what's going on. If I have hypervigilance, I don't want to be in child's pose, man. I used to find that real hard before I dealt with my own trauma, being in child's pose, my head down. It's a very exposed position. As a martial artist, I was like, no, yeah. Okay, so we have the numbing symptoms, which might look like emotional numbing, physical numbing, so it might be difficult to feel the body. The other thing that can happen with that in a yoga context is people can like want to feel, they get addicted to the intensity of, say, a hot yoga practice or a very intense Stanga practice, for example. And I think this is going on in a lot of major cities around the world. People are pushing themselves harder and faster. They're in these adrenalized cities, which is like a trauma response in itself, adds to that trauma response. You know, on stimulants on a daily basis, coffee, very widespread now. God, I sound a bit hyper-aroused myself, don't I, today? I'm in Moscow, super, super fast place, and it adds to that. It adds to that sense, yeah. So what I worry about is that people are doing those kinds of yoga, A, as an addiction, B, as a way to feel, because it sort of pushes through the numbing, yeah, but that again can get addictive. It's not necessarily the healthiest way to feel if you need intense sensation to feel. It's why extreme sports, S&M, martial arts, all those things can be real appealing to traumatized people. It's like finally I can feel something, even if it's hard or unpleasant. The risk of injury, of course, in that pushing, driving faster, harder, more. People who've been abused often self-abuse as well. I think it's Matthew Remsky that said, yoga is one of those places where you can go and self-abuse and actually get kudos for it. So in a few places in the modern world, you can go and put yourself in pain, and that's seen as somehow spiritual or cleansing or some other thing. So being very careful with intense practice, being aware that people may be using it as a way to feel or as a way even to abuse themselves. Yeah, so that's also related to the numbing symptoms. Slow down, take a breath. So hyperarousal, noticing again how that might push people towards more intense practice or might make them find it difficult to a more relaxed practice like yin might be very unbearable. The numbing we talked about, and then we have the reliving symptoms. So these are perhaps less rare, but it could look like a student constantly distracted by something. Yeah, if they can't, again can get in the way of concentration. That's there's things like that. So I saw in my life I just kept thinking about, kept playing over and over again. And then we have like full-blown dissociative flashbacks, like rarer, but you will see them, helping people stabilize, get present in the body. There's a way in which people start to space out, and it can happen when you ask them to go to the body or do very intense practice. Some people almost confuse this with some sort of spiritual thing. No, okay. So staying anchored in grounded experience in the body, like what is the sensation of your feet? What parts of your feet are touching the floor now? What imprint would your feet make in sand? There's lots of things you can do to help people kind of stay present in sensation. But watching out for that floating out, that numbing out, that out, back and out, forwards and out thing that can happen. And I said, well, I'm not going to teach you to be a therapist. That would be crazy. I'm not even a therapist myself. But basic kind of, belly breathing, feeling your feet, feeling your boundaries is good. Getting people to do something like plank pose or to push against you as if they were doing plank pose. That sense of sort of feeling one's strengths and boundaries can be really healing for people with trauma. Like, I don't want to scare all the yoga teachers off. It's not like you do yoga, you're going to traumatize people. I would say this: if you're doing yoga without this knowledge, you may well be deepening people's trauma. But yoga can be a massive healing journey, right? To safely, manageably recontact the body in a supportive space, to learn boundaries again, to have a teacher that respects boundaries, to be able to regulate yourself, to be able to do all the things that happen, breathing exercises. These are amazing tools for traumatized people. When I'm working with groups that have had trauma or I'm trying to build resilience to trauma, because, there's an 80% prevalence of some traumatic incident, even in Britain, in your lifetime. Imagine the States, pretty similar. So, we all need some resilience to that. And this is some of the, meditation, yoga, these are some of the best tools for resilience to trauma and trauma recovery. So I'm not trying to scare everyone off. So what have we talked about? Talked about the reliving flashbacks, so the numbing, the hyperarousal, major kind of trauma symptoms that exist. So how does this apply to teaching? Well, I've mentioned some of the stuff around intensity, around boundaries, around certain postures, certain positions. There's a lot more there. I think also, in terms of knowing when to refer. Yeah, so if a student comes up to you, says something was triggered, yes, empathize. Yes, maybe stabilize with a breathing technique, but also, have in your phone some local therapists, the rape crisis helpline, the local group that helps people, male survivors of abuse, having a few of those numbers handy. Like in Brighton where I live, I can do that. And if let's say I'm teaching in Moscow at the moment, there's local people, right? There's local people that are there. If you're doing deep work, and I think some of the riskiest ones I've seen would be things like Kundalini or kind of borderline sort of therapeutic stuff, like the stuff we're doing in embodiment yoga. This stuff's really essential, and it can be really helpful to have someone who is a trained therapist or a counsellor on hand, on like a weekend workshop or a week retreat, for example, when you're away from it all. Having someone that's a backup, that's on hand, that can hold that professional space, I think is really important. So this video is getting a bit epic already, so that's 20 minutes. I'm going to make sure I've tried to cover some of the basics here. I'm sure I'm missing things. I'm doing this without notes. So some awareness of basic trauma responses, knowing that that's a bodily response. also a psychological response in terms of how people think, you know, black and white thinking, them and us thinking. I see a lot of this in Russia, which is a traumatized culture. Certain cultures are more traumatized. You know, when I'm working with Israel, for example, I see a lot of them and us. I see a lot of black and white. People hearing criticism when there isn't criticism. That's an interesting one as a teacher. Kind of psychological patterns, the catastrophizing. You know, I can't do this posture, so it's the end of the world. You'll see those kind of psychological patterns, emotional predispositions to anger and fear. What else? Spiritually, yeah, spiritually is an interesting one. So it can cause a lack of meaning. A lot of Holocaust survivors had this. You know, there is no God, and the world means nothing. It can cause social isolation as well. Like, you wouldn't understand. I don't belong. Now that's very interesting from a yoga point of view, isn't it? We're working with spirituality, we're working with meaning. How is it to have people that might not relate to that, might be very cynical towards that? Cynicism is one of the things you see with burnout as well as trauma, actually, both of those things. So yeah, and also, you know, the healing that can be done there, a new sense of meaning. Maybe they lost their, you know, Christian beliefs, and now they're having more New Age or Buddhist or some other sort of set of beliefs can come in, which can be really healing from that point of view. Socially, you know, like in the yoga class, unless it's an acro yoga class or something like that, there isn't much social interaction. It's mediated, which can actually be very safe for people who have trauma, who maybe don't like social interaction or find difficulties or fear in that. So there can be a way in which you can build community without it being threatening to people. Certainly not making people do partner practice against their will. Again, consent, calibration, big things here. Calibration is like not making things too intense, giving people great, which is just good yoga teaching anyway, right? Like giving people scales, here's some alternatives. Not kind of suggesting the hardest one is the best one. Yeah, not good for anyone, let alone traumatized people. I mean, a lot of good like trauma stuff is just good yoga teaching, which is actually surprisingly rare in my slightly snobby opinion. So what else? The social stuff, the meaning stuff. You know, knowing that you can heal, right? Like I was teaching a workshop with soldiers, for soldiers in Ukraine not long ago, and I described the trauma symptoms, and they were just like, yeah, that's me, problems with my wife, you know, problems with boundaries, hyperarousal, numbing, blah, 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 using alcohols, medication, blah, blah, blah. They were like lighting up, but they were still like, yeah, but what do I do? And then I said, you know, there are things you can do, and I had the numbers of some Ukrainian therapists. There's many sort of potential treatments out there. Remember, you're not qualified unless you're an actual therapist, not like a yoga therapist. Things out there, for example, EMDR, it's an eye movement thing. I've had that, that's good. CBT, behavioral therapy, you know, exposure therapy, there can be some good stuff in that. What else? There's something called TRE, which has a mixed report, but I quite like. I've used that with AIDS workers. There's standing versions of that. If you see like that kind of shaking response in a yoga class after a hard leg, kind of a hard yoga session where it works the legs, and that can be part of that trauma release as well. And it's very helpful to just let people shake. If it gets too much, you can always stand up, straighten the legs, it will stop. Yeah, so that kind of tremoring that can happen after leg work can be actually a trauma release. You're accidentally doing TRE essentially. Tapping, EFT, some people swear by. You know, one of the best trauma therapists in the world that I know, called Shoshana Garfield, some of her videos are on my channel, swears by that. Other people hate it. You know, I've heard mixed things. It seems to work for some people. EMDR, theory, there's somatic experiencing, there's various other body modalities, which if people are doing yoga, they might be interested in the body, so putting them towards those body modalities, I think, can be helpful. Talking therapies tend to work less well, because it's not really at the neocortical level trauma, it's in the whole system. So we need to get rid of that charge, that stuck fight or flight response that's in the system somehow. Yeah, and yoga can be one of the ways to do that. It can be part of a healing journey. You know, I think the healing journey needs to be psychosocial, relational. We heal in relationship, we heal in love, right? And a teacher can be part of that, a community of yogis can be part of that. Yeah, psychosocial, spiritual, meaningful, all those psychological, all of these levels I think are really needed. So like any good trauma recovery package will include different things and not just like one therapy like EMDR, which is great, but then it's also the other aspects to it that are there. So there is hope. That's a message you can give to people. You can tell them about some of these things. There's even an app, a PTSD app. It's actually pretty good, and there's lots of good self-help books if people, you know, you see something like a sort of numbing response or hyperarousal response, and you kind of suspiciously think, you know what, maybe this person's having some trauma. You can just do like an overhead to the class and say, yeah, you know, sometimes trauma is one of those things that happens to us. Here's a book I recommend. Leave a copy on the side. You don't have to single someone out. You know, you can kind of nudge people that way. My sense is that, you know, a lot of people have a trauma. Like it's something in the States, the figure is something like 1 in 6 men and 1 in 4 women has had some kind of abuse or rape, for example. I mean, that's just one kind of trauma. Add to that car accidents, assaults, all the wars, you know, the stuff with veterans. A lot of people doing yoga with veterans, absolutely fantastic, good natured, good hearted, but know about this stuff. If you're doing yoga with refugees or veterans or any of these, you know, more vulnerable populations, we can call them, you definitely need to know this stuff, not just the video. Go on a course. Yeah, some of the people I recommended. But as I said, because of the figures, it's many people, right? So I think this is something that's common knowledge, should be taught in school, should definitely be taught in a 200-hour yoga teacher training. Do pass this on to your students, do share it around. I'm not trying to make money from this. This is something I just think should be out there in the world in a big way. And even like, what is this, 25 minutes? Even a 25-minute video is a bit of education that can make an absolutely huge difference, to people's lives, and to not harming people, to doing no harm, and pointing people, referring on, pointing people into some healthy directions. I'm sure I've forgotten some really useful stuff, but I don't want this video to get too epic because I want people to see it. So yeah, trauma education, worth knowing about. There are my thoughts. Look up some of the other people in this area who are offering online trainings, books on the subject. You know, this is something that you can upskill on relatively easily. So thank you very much for your time.